2NURFM 103.7, as you pretty much can't escape it at the moment. Over the weekend, election was called by the Prime Minister, and towards the end of May, we'll all be going to the polls. And joining us to cover the election this morning is our Professor of Politics out of the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jost. Well, Jim, it's finally
Good morning,
happened.
Mark.
It's finally happened. It took a while, but we got there.
Yes, what everyone was expecting, but it hadn't actually been sort of finalised in terms of this is actually the date, even though we all knew that the only date that it was going to be would be May 21. But it's here now, and we have to deal with the issues of, whatever the parties are standing for and the politicians, but also navigating the electoral process. And maybe we can just dwell on that a little bit, you know.
Yeah, and for some, it can be a little bit, well, what do I do here? It's a little bit daunting. How does it work? I mean, you take us through some of the, if not the basics, but the fundamentals of how our vote actually works.
Well, if we deal with the lower house first, the House of Representatives. And
the green room.
Yes, well, exactly. The ballot paper's green.
Yes.
And that's where the government gets formed. The party with the majority of seats at the end of the election forms a government in the lower house. So that candidates are elected to the lower house on the basis of compulsory preferential voting. And so let's say there are there are 6 candidates. You have to put a number in each square. There'll be 6 squares on the ballot paper. The order of candidates is random. It's generated before the election and obviously before the thing's printed, so that no one knows who's actually going to be at the top of the ballot, and in that way they don't privilege somebody whose name starts with A, and they don't get, Adam Aardvark standing for Parliament, etc. So you number the boxes from 1 to 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in the order that you prefer the candidate. So the top candidate in the list might be your worst candidate, so you might put them at number 6. The middle candidate, say, at point 3, you make them number 1, etc. And until all the boxes are filled. It is, most ballots are formal, are only informal if there are a number of irregularities. So if you write on the ballot paper and you can be identified from that writing, then your ballot won't count.
So leaving my name and address on last year is probably not a good idea.
Not a good idea, unless you want the ballot to be discarded.
Now, Jim, take us through what happens with informal voting, because there are a lot of people that either genuinely make a mistake and it goes in the box, or they intentionally do something to make their vote not count. So let's say you have 5% of the votes that are informal. What happens to that percentage, those votes?
Well, those votes won't count.
Yep.
They're excluded from contributing to the outcome. Well, I suppose in a general sense they contribute to the outcome insofar as they're part of the total number of votes, ballots cast, but they don't count towards any candidate. There are a number of reasons why ballot paper might be deemed informal. As I said, about writing on it, but the returning officer may not have signed it, and when they issued the ballot paper, or missed out signing it, or you may have somehow or other come across a blank ballot paper and just simply walked off and decided to fill it out before it got ticked off. You might mess up the ballot paper by putting 2 numbers the same. If you recognise that you've made a mistake on the ballot paper, you can go to the electoral officer and say, look, I've made a mistake. They'll go, okay, no problem. Here's the replacement ballot paper. They take yours and it goes into a discarded ballot pile and it no longer counts, and you can then cast your vote as you see fit in the correct fashion, and then it counts.
And off you go. Now, the other paper we get, which is generally, if you're an environmentalist, you never like to see the Senate paper because it's usually a very long piece. As usual, you can vote one above the line or every single number underneath if you choose.
Since 2016, and it applied in the last election in 2019, the above-the-line voting, which is basically has groups or parties listed above, they log their preferences with the Electoral Commission. I'm not sure the exact timing, but it's well before the election, so that the preferences aren't made public, as it were, even though the party might say, look, we're going to preference so-and-so and so-and-so. But basically they're not part of the ballot. So you above the line, you have to number 6 boxes, up to 6. There might be 12, 13 groups, but you only need to number maximum of 6 in the preference order that you choose. Similarly, when you go below the line, and this is where it can get a bit tricky, but the rules changed, like I said, in 2016, so that instead of numbering every single square, you only have to number 12. So you only have to go from 1 to 12, and then it's a legal ballot. Because, as you said, the Senate ballot paper can be quite long, quite wide, I suppose you'd say.
Yeah.
I seem to remember one being well over a metre at one election, and that was the one which I think I numbered every single box below the line because there was a candidate that I wanted to go very last, and I wanted to make sure that in numbering the boxes I didn't mess it up.
Right, no matter what, that at least, even if only one person in the country put them last, you were that person. Well, that's fair enough, and also getting value for money on that big slice of paper as well. Here's something I'm going to throw out there. And this is contrary to how most of us have thought, the fact that these changes have come in, and they're fairly recent, the fact that we no longer have can no longer have people out the front giving the how to vote cards or their preference how to vote cards, I wonder what impact that is going to make on people just stuffing it up, or at least not necessarily voting completely the way they would want, particularly in the Senate.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with the how to vote cards and people standing outside the polling booth. Given the sort of post-COVID period, that's going to be, I guess, a matter for the parties and also a matter for the members and whether they can get people to come out in the way that they used to come out pre-COVID. So, yes, if there's a sort of decline in the number of people available to hand out how to vote cards, that might have some impact on how people vote. People may end up sort of being a bit more random about what they do. I suspect probably about 20 to 30% of voters make their mind up on the day when they literally are in the polling booth. There's probably as many as those again who have already made up their mind. Some of whom have probably will do early polling. They will, for one reason or another, vote early and get it out of the way. Then the rest are sort of they're already leaning one way or the other, and by the time they get to the polling booth, they've pretty well made up their mind.
Yeah, it's just interesting though. I mean, not so much in many of the Hunter seats, but certainly a lot of seats around the country that are on a knife edge. You know, a handful of votes either way can mean the difference between getting into Parliament, potentially in getting your party into government or not, or being, you coming in at number 2. So I don't know, a lot of that stuff in those seats may make a difference.
Well, most certainly will, and that can possibly translate into a skewing of the number of seats that get won, because it only needs a handful of votes in probably a dozen seats to shift the outcome one way or another, and a party might end up with, shall we say, a vote nationally favouring it, giving it well over 50%. But because of the nature of the knife edges, shall we say, in marginal electorates, those electorates may go the other way, even though there might still be a swing to the party that's sort of dominant, and those seats go to the other party or the other major party. And if they happen to be, as the case might be now, if they happen to be the Liberal National Party coalition, they then get to stay in government. Or if they happen to be the Labor Party, they might then have a chance of sort of forming a government. But, I guess I'd say, Mark, every vote counts. The idea that, even if you're in a safe seat and you think, well, it's not going to really matter whether I vote this way or that way because, it's a foregone conclusion. However, if you don't vote, the vote doesn't count at all.
No, and even if you're in a safe seat and you want to, think, well, I'm in a seat that votes X, but I want to vote Y. Well, even if enough people do that to bring the lead that they have down, at least that sends a message that a party would have to look at.
Exactly. It sends a message to the, shall we say, the dominant party in that particular seat that, hey, you're not as safe as you think. You're not as popular as you think. You need to be taking this into account and recognise that, there might be 40% of the voters in this seat would have preferred the other major candidate, or indeed a minor party, but because of the way that the votes come out, you were successful again. But it's a message that, all candidates or successful candidates need to look at which way the trends went in their particular seat, and to take that into account, and perhaps work a bit harder as a candidate in the seat over the next 3 years to win that support back. And I think in wrapping up, Mark, one final thing I'd like to say is that the Australian system is not the American system. The government's formed in the lower house, and the executive of the government is part of the parliament, drawn from both houses of parliament, whereas in the United States, with the presidential system and their particular structure of government, the executive is outside the Congress, what we might call their parliament, and is therefore not necessarily accountable to it in the same way. So in Australia, our executive, the Prime Minister and Cabinet and so forth, they are supposed to be accountable to the Parliament as a whole. I mean, as we know, the lower house is where the numbers are for the government, and if they've got control of the lower house, it's unlikely that they'll be censured by the Parliament. However, the principle remains that the Parliament is the body to whom the government, or the executive of the government, should be accountable. And perhaps over the next 3 years we might see whichever party wins government strengthening that just a little bit to ensure that there's a bit more accountability on the part of our elected members of Parliament that form the government, so that they can begin to restore some of the trust that has eroded over the past decade or so.
All right, we'll see how all of that goes, Jim. A few weeks to go before it is all happening, so we'll look forward to hearing you in a couple of weeks from now. It's always a pleasure.
Yep, pleasure, Mark. Cheers.
Our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose, at 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.